Agnes, a sweet 68-year-old knitter, was just trying to make ends meet after her husband passed. Little did she know, her needles held the key to saving her town's beloved, but failing, woolen mill. You won't believe how her simple hobby sparked a revolution. A millionaire CEO laughed when an 8-year-old girl said she could fix his Mustang. He had no idea she was about to destroy his entire company and rebuild it better. Richard Miller wasn't supposed to be here. The outskirts of Detroit, with their crumbling warehouses and forgotten auto shops, were a far cry from his glass-walled office on the 40th floor. His driver had taken a wrong turn, and rather than wait in his luxury car, Richard, out of curiosity or boredom, decided to stretch his legs. The garage he entered was a skeleton of what it must have been decades ago. Faded signage, rusted tools, and the stale smell of old oil filled the air. But what caught his eye wasn't the place. It was the small figure buried under the hood of a Mustang. A child, maybe 7 or 8, stood on a wooden crate, her arms deep inside the car's engine bay. She was petite, with messy blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail. Her gray t-shirt smeared with grease, the bright red of her oversized coveralls dulled by work and wear. Her face was focused, lips pursed as her small hands maneuvered a wrench with precision far beyond her years. Richard leaned against the garage doorway, amused. "You fixing that old thing, kid?" he asked, his tone half mocking, half curious. The girl didn't look up. "I'm not a kid. I'm a mechanic," she said flatly, tightening a bolt with a satisfying click. He couldn't help but laugh. "Is that so? All right, little mechanic. Tell you what, you fix that Mustang. It's yours." He said it without thinking. Just another arrogant promise from a man who never expected to be challenged. He had made offers like that before to men twice her age who had cracked under the pressure. But this, a scrawny girl in a dusty garage, there was no way. She finally looked up, and when their eyes met, something inside Richard faltered. Her gaze was sharp, ice blue, and unflinching. She wasn't playing games. "Okay," she said simply, and ducked back under the hood. An old man appeared from the back room, wiping his hands on a rag. His hair was silver, his posture stooped, but his eyes mirrored the girl's, calm and cutting. "She'll hold you to that, mister," he muttered as he passed by, his tone neither friendly nor hostile, just a fact. Richard stayed, leaning casually, though his smirk began to fade as he watched the girl work. She wasn't fumbling or guessing. Every tool she picked up was with purpose. Every adjustment was precise. He checked his watch. 20 minutes passed. 30, then an hour. And all the while, the little girl never lost focus. The garage echoed with a roar when she finally twisted the key. The Mustang's engine, which had looked like a dead relic when Richard first walked in, came alive with a deep, throaty growl. It was perfect. Better than perfect. "Emma," she introduced herself only after wiping her hands on a rag, stepped back from the car, her face streaked with oil but glowing with pride. "You owe me a Mustang," she said, for the first time in a long while. Richard Miller was speechless. He wasn't a man easily impressed, yet here he was being schooled by an 8-year-old girl in a rundown garage. Something inside him twisted, a rare mix of admiration and shame. He took out his wallet, but Emma shook her head. "Not money." "You said, the car." The old man, Frank, watched from the doorway, a ghost of a smile on his face. Richard had no choice. He tossed the keys to Emma, who caught them with a grin. It should have ended there, a fluke encounter, a humorous story to tell at the next board meeting. But Richard didn't leave. He couldn't. Something about that girl, about this place, clung to him, and for a reason he couldn't yet name. He knew this wasn't the last time he'd see Emma Blake. It was in fact just the beginning. The next morning, Richard Miller found himself back in front of that same garage, sitting in his sleek black sedan, staring at the faded building through the windshield. He wasn't sure why he had come. Millionaire EOS didn't make a habit of revisiting dusty auto shops after tossing off foolish promises. But something about yesterday refused to let him move on. He watched as Emma, still in that same gray t-shirt and red overalls, rolled up the garage door. She didn't notice him. She was too busy dragging a large toolbox toward the Mustang. It was hers now. Richard had left the title on the workbench, fully expecting she wouldn't know what to do with it. But there she was, bright and early, ready to keep working, as if owning a classic car at 8 years old was perfectly normal. Richard stepped out of his car, adjusting his cufflinks out of habit more than necessity. The sound of his expensive Italian shoes on gravel caught Emma's attention. She looked up unimpressed. "You're back," she stated, not asked. He smiled, unsure how to explain himself. "Couldn't sleep. That Mustang of yours has been keeping me up." Emma wiped her hands on a rag, eyeing him with suspicion. "Worried I'll crash it?" "Not quite," Richard replied. "I'm more worried you'll rebuild it better than my entire team of engineers." She tilted her head slightly as if weighing whether or not his comment was a joke. Then she shrugged. "Maybe." Frank appeared from inside carrying 2 mugs of coffee, one of which he silently offered to Richard. The gesture was simple, but Richard understood the meaning. "You're welcome to stay, but don't waste our time." They sat on overturned crates while Emma worked, the air filled with the soft linking of tools. Richard noticed the way Frank watched his granddaughter, not with nervousness, but with quiet pride. She didn't need supervision. She was in her element. You trained her? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Frank shook his head. Emma doesn't get trained, she listens, she learns. Then she does it her own way. It was humbling. Richard, a man who commanded boardrooms and signed billion-dollar deals, sat silently as an 8-year-old disassembled and reassembled one of the most iconic cars ever built. Every movement she made had purpose. There was no guesswork, no hesitation. As the afternoon sun streamed through the garage's broken windows, Emma crawled out from under the car, wiped sweat from her forehead and motioned to Richard. Want to see something? She asked. He followed her to the Mustang. She popped the hood and pointed to a part of the engine that had been completely reworked. It wasn't just fixed, it was improved. It wasn't breathing right. Too restricted, she explained. I opened it up. It'll run smoother now. Richard was speechless again. She wasn't repeating instructions from some manual. She understood the machine, felt its flaws, and solved them with a kind of mechanical intuition no amount of corporate training could replicate. You don't know who I am, do you? He asked suddenly. Emma wiped her hands again, clearly indifferent. You're the guy who gave me a Mustang. That's all I care about. It was a punch to his ego, but in an oddly refreshing way. Here in this little garage, his titles meant nothing. Emma didn't care about shareholders or press releases. She cared about the hum of an engine, the perfect alignment of gears, the way a machine should feel. For the first time in years, Richard felt small, not in a belittling way, but in the way a man feels when he realizes the world is bigger than his office. That genius isn't confined to corporate towers. As he watched Emma slide back under the Mustang, humming softly to herself, Richard knew with absolute certainty that he had just witnessed something extraordinary, and leaving wasn't an option anymore. Richard Miller wasn't a man who asked questions about people's lives. He was used to contracts, numbers, and polished presentations, not stories of loss and survival. Yet, after spending 2 afternoons at that crumbling garage, curiosity nodded at him. He needed to understand how a little girl like Emma Blake came to master machines in a place the world had clearly forgotten. He arrived earlier this time, bringing with him a box of pastries and 2 large coffees. It was a weak attempt at politeness, something his peer team would have laughed at. But to his surprise, Frank accepted them with a nod, as if he'd been expecting this gesture all along. Emma barely acknowledged him, already deep into her work, her small hand smudged with oil before the sun had fully risen. Frank motioned to a worn-out bench near the back of the garage. They sat, the air thick with the scent of gasoline and rust. As Emma's soft humming echoed through the space, for a while, they said nothing. Only the sound of turning wrenches and linking tools filled the silence. She's been here since she was 4, Frank finally said, his voice low, steady. After the accident, Richard listened, not interrupting. He knew this wasn't a story that needed questions. My daughter Lily and her husband Mark were both mechanics, not the clean suit dealership kind. The real kind. They used to bring Emma here on weekends. She would sit on the workbench playing with bolts and sockets like they were toys. One night, a drunk driver hit them head-on. Emma was supposed to be in that car, but she had a fever that day. So I kept her here. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he took a sip of coffee. His eyes remained on Emma, who was oblivious to the weight of their conversation, too focused on coaxing life from the Mustang. After that, we barely scraped by. I couldn't afford to fix this place, let alone keep up with fancy shops in the city. But Emma, she kept showing up here every morning, said the cars needed her. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat, a rare and uncomfortable sensation. He glanced around the garage, noticing the little signs of Emma's world. Tiny handprints on the old tool chest, a child's drawing of a Mustang taped to the wall. Sockets organized not by size, but by how often she used them. You could have asked for help, Richard said, though the words fell hollow the moment they left his mouth. Frank gave a dry chuckle. From who? The city charities. They don't fund old men with greasy hands. And Emma, she didn't want pity. She wanted engines. Richard understood that. He saw it now, clear as day. Emma wasn't some child hobbyist. She was surviving. Every bolt she tightened was a way to keep her parents' memory alive. Every car she fixed was her way of refusing to be forgotten, like the shop they left behind. But what struck Richard most wasn't just Emma's skill. It was her need to create. She didn't just fix the Mustang because of a childish dare. She did it because machines were the only place where her world still made sense. As the afternoon waned, Emma called out, her voice light and casual. Mr. Miller, want to see her breathe again? Richard approached as she turned the key. The engine purred smoother than it had the day before. Emma's face lit up, proud but calm, as if she had known all along what the outcome would be. She's not just fixed, Emma said, she's better. Richard looked at Frank, who gave a quiet nod, as if to say, now you see it. 2. Standing there watching this little girl who had rebuilt a car while carrying the weight of a world that had overlooked her, Richard felt something stir inside him. It wasn't sympathy or corporate opportunity. It was deeper than that. It was respect, the kind that demanded action. He knew then that he couldn't just admire Emma from afar. The world needed to see what she could do, but first, he would have to earn her trust, and that of the old man who had kept this miracle hidden in a forgotten garage. And for the first time in his life, Richard Miller wanted to do something not for profit, but because it felt right. The following week, Richard Miller sat in his office, the Detroit skyline stretching out behind him, but his thoughts were miles away, trapped in a small oil-stained garage, where an 8-year-old girl had outperformed his entire engineering team. His assistant had just placed a stack of reports on his desk, summaries of recent or back-end projects, each filled with diagrams, cost analyses and predictions. None of it mattered, not after seeing Emma. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, a rare moment of doubt creeping in. If what Emma did to that Mustang was a fluke, then this obsession was foolish. But Richard had built an empire on instinct, and his instinct screamed that this wasn't luck. Emma Blake was the real thing. The idea had been forming in his mind for days, and now it felt urgent. His company hosted an annual private competition, a grueling internal challenge where engineers were tasked with solving complex automotive problems under strict conditions. It was designed for senior-level staff, but Richard was going to bend the rules. He drove to the garage that afternoon, skipping meetings and ignoring phone calls. Emma was there as always, perched on a stool, scribbling something on a grease-stained notepad. Frank looked up as Richard entered, raising an eyebrow, not surprised in the slightest. "I have a proposition," Richard said without wasting time. "There's a competition at my company. It's meant for engineers, but I want you in it." He was looking at Emma as he spoke, but the words were also meant for Frank. Emma's nose wrinkled in confusion. "A competition? Like a race?" "Not exactly," Richard smiled. "More like fixing problems. Complicated problems. It's a bit of a game, really." Frank's face tightened. He didn't like the sound of this, and Richard could sense the tension. "You trying to parade her around for your shareholders?" Frank asked, his tone sharp, protective. Richard shook his head. "No cameras, no press. Just a room, some tools, and a problem to solve. If she doesn't want to, I'll never mention it again." His voice was calm, but there was urgency beneath it. He needed them to understand this wasn't charity. He wasn't here to make a feel-good headline. Emma's eyes narrowed. Her curiosity piqued. "What kind of problem?" Richard smiled. "The kind nobody's been able to solve for months." Frank sighed, rubbing his face as if the weight of the world rested in his palms. After a long silence, he looked at Emma. "It's your call, kiddo." Emma grinned, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I'll do it." The following day, Richard personally escorted them into the company's engineering lab. The space was a stark contrast to their little garage, sleek, sterile, and humming with quiet efficiency. Men and women in lab coats paused their work to glance at the unlikely trio walking through their sanctuary. The head of our backslashand, a sharp-suited man named Daniel Crow, approached with a forced smile. "Richard, this is highly irregular," he said, eyeing Emma with thinly veiled disdain. "We have protocols." "I'm aware," Richard interrupted. "She's my guest, and she's here to solve the intake optimization challenge your team has been failing at." Murmurs echoed through the lab. The problem was a notoriously difficult airflow design flaw in their latest prototype engine. Dozens of engineers had taken a crack at it, and yet here was an 8-year-old girl in red overalls stepping up as if it were a school science project. Emma was unfazed. She walked to the workstation, scanning the blueprints laid out on the screen. The room watched, expecting her to flounder, but within minutes, she was pointing at a section of the diagram. "You're suffocating it," she said simply. "The bends here and here are forcing air to fight itself. It's like trying to breathe through a straw that twists too much." The engineers exchanged skeptical glances, but Richard said nothing. He just watched. Emma didn't ask for permission. She grabbed a tablet, adjusted the design, then walked over to the 3D printer, directing one of the startled technicians to help her fabricate a revised part. Within 2 hours, she had a prototype in hand. The test was run that afternoon. As the numbers flashed on the screen, the entire room fell into stunned silence. Efficiency had increased by 13, not a minor improvement, not a small step forward. It was the breakthrough they'd been chasing for nearly a year. Daniel Crow stood frozen, his face pale. Richard turned to him, his smile razor-sharp. "You were saying something about protocols." Emma, oblivious to the undercurrents of corporate politics, simply wiped her hands and asked if she could get a sandwich. She was hungry. That night, as Richard sat in his office replaying the day's events, he realized the stakes had just changed. Emma wasn't just a prodigy. She was a revolution waiting to happen. But he also knew the walls of his company wouldn't welcome her easily. There would be resistance, jealousy, fear. Richard looked out over the city lights, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. He had seen many battles in his career, but this one felt personal. He had invited Emma into his world. Now he had to protect her from it. It happened on a gray Thursday morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and the city feels colder than it should. Richard Miller was in his office sifting through a stack of internal reports. When his assistant's face appeared at the door, she didn't knock, didn't announce herself as usual. There was tension in her eyes, a look that told him something was wrong before she even opened her mouth. "Mr. Miller, the police, or at Blake's garage." For a moment, the words didn't register. Then, like a snap, Richard was on his feet. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. His car was waiting downstairs, but he didn't have the patience for traffic, so he called the helicopter. Within minutes, the cityscape was a blur beneath him. When he arrived, the scene was already unfolding like a bad movie. 2 squad cars parked in front of the garage, lights spinning. Frank Blake stood by the entrance, his hands cuffed behind his back, flanked by 2 officers. Emma was on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a pale mask of confusion and anger. There were no tears, just that intense, unblinking stare that Richard had come to recognize as Emma's shield when the world was being cruel. The officer in charge, a stocky man with thinning hair, approached Richard the moment he stepped out of the car. "Mr. Miller, we're just doing our job. We received a report about stolen auto parts, high-value components traced back to this location." Richard didn't blink. "From who?" "That information's confidential, sir." "Of course. It was confidential, convenient, and timed perfectly." Richard scanned the scene. The supposed evidence, a crate of parts, had been dumped haphazardly near the workbench. It was obvious to anyone who had ever set foot in a garage that the setup was wrong. Frank Blake might have been many things, but a thief wasn't one of them. This was orchestrated, sloppy but dangerous. Richard's mind raced. There were only a handful of people within his company who would stoop to this level. He didn't need to guess. He knew exactly who had pulled these strings. Daniel Crow. After Emma's performance in the lab, Crow's position had been shaken. A child had out-engineered him, humiliated him in front of his peers. Men like Crow didn't forget such things. They retaliated. Richard turned back to the officer. "You're making a mistake. This is a setup. I will have my legal team here in 10 minutes. And I strongly suggest you reconsider how you're proceeding." But the wheels were already in motion. Frank was being loaded into the back of the squad car, Emma chasing after him, her small fists pounding against the officer's legs. Her voice shrill and panicked. "You can't take him. He didn't do anything. Those aren't even ours." Richard moved faster than he thought he could, scooping Emma up before she got herself hurt. She struggled against him, fighting not out of fear, but out of pure defiance. "Put me down. I have to stop them." "I will," Richard said quietly but firmly. "But you need to trust me, Emma." She froze at that, her breathing rapid, her eyes wild. Then slowly, she stilled, the tension draining from her limbs as she buried her face into his shoulder. It wasn't weakness, it was exhaustion. Even a warrior needs a moment to breathe. By the end of the hour, Richard's lawyers had flooded the precinct, tearing apart the flimsy accusations with precision. The parts had been purchased legitimately months ago. Invoices intact, records bulletproof. There was no case, but the damage was done. Frank was released, his dignity bruised, but his resolve hardened. Back at the garage, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard sat with Frank and Emma in the same spot where their journey had started. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with shared understanding. This wasn't about parts. This was about power, about a corporation terrified of a little girl who didn't play by their rules. Frank lit a cigarette, his hand still trembling slightly. "I've seen this before," he muttered. "When someone doesn't fit into their neat little box, they try to crush them." "They tried the wrong family," Richard said. Emma was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching something on a piece of cardboard. She didn't say much, but Richard noticed how her eyes darted up every so often, as if to make sure Frank was still there. She had built a fortress of calm around herself, but the cracks were visible now. Richard knew then that keeping Emma in the shadows wasn't an option anymore. The vultures would keep circling. She had exposed a weakness in their system, and they wouldn't rest until they buried her talent under bureaucracy and scandal. He had underestimated how vicious the corporate world could be when threatened. But now he was angry, and Richard Miller, when angry, didn't just defend. He attacked. "I want you both at the company tomorrow," Richard said, his voice cold with focus. "We're done playing in the shadows. If they want to see what a real revolution looks like, we'll give them a front row seat." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're going to put a kid in front of your board?" "She's not a kid," Richard said, looking at Emma as she meticulously adjusted the lines of her sketch. "She's a mechanic, and it's time they learned her name." Frank looked at Emma, then back at Richard. For the first time since their paths had crossed, there was no skepticism in his expression, only a quiet nod of agreement. That night, as Richard drove home, he wasn't thinking about damage control or pure strategies. He was thinking about Emma's future, and how he was going to burn down the walls that stood in her way. He knew the next battle would be ugly, but for the first time in a long while, Richard Miller wasn't fighting for his company or his legacy. He was fighting for a girl who had fixed his Mustang and unknowingly had started to fix him, too. The boardroom at Miller Automotive was a cathedral of glass and steel, a place where power whispered through polished mahogany tables and gleamed from designer cufflinks. Richard Miller had sat at the head of that table for years, mastering every nuance of control, but today the air felt different. It wasn't nervousness, it was the electricity that comes when a man knows he's about to burn the rule book in front of an audience that thinks they own it. The night before, Richard had made the decision: no more backdoor deals. No more whispered promises in quiet garages. Emma Blake's revolution wouldn't be hidden in some engineering lab. She would be unveiled on the biggest stage they had, the company's annual innovation presentation, an event broadcasted live, attended by industry giants, investors, and the relentless eyes of the media. That morning, the entire building buzzed with a subtle undercurrent of chaos. News had leaked that Richard was planning something unorthodox, which was corporate speak for he's gone mad. The PR department was in a frenzy trying to anticipate damage control strategies. The board members huddled in glass offices, murmuring like anxious stock traders. But Richard was calm. He had been at the top long enough to know that real change never came with a polite knock on the door. Sometimes you had to kick it off its hinges. Emma and Frank arrived quietly unnoticed among the waves of suited executives. Emma wore her usual red overalls, slightly faded now, a gray t-shirt underneath, and her blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked completely out of place in this temple of tailored perfection, yet somehow more real than everyone else combined. Frank, on the other hand, carried himself like a man who had seen enough boardrooms to know when they were about to be shaken. Richard met them backstage. He crouched to Emma's level, his voice steady but softer than usual. You don't need to impress anyone out there. Just do what you always do. Fix the problem. Emma nodded, clutching a small drive in her hand. It held the prototype design she had been refining with Frank over the past week. An entirely new airflow system for their electric engine. It wasn't just an improvement. It was a leap forward, something that could redefine their entire product line. Meanwhile, on stage, the event had begun, a polished affair of rehearsed speeches and safe innovation. Daniel Crowe stood at the podium, delivering a predictable presentation filled with buzzwords and numbers meant to soothe investors. Richard stood in the shadows, watching, waiting. The moment Crowe clicked to the final slide, Richard stepped onto the stage, his entrance cutting through the applause like a blade. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his tone warm, but with a weight that commanded immediate attention. Before we conclude, there's one more demonstration. Something that wasn't on the program. Crowe's face tightened, his jaw clenched so hard it could have cracked glass. The audience shifted, murmurs rippling as Richard gestured to the side of the stage. Emma walked out, small and seemingly fragile under the harsh stage lights. But her steps were steady. She carried with her none of the anxiety the corporate world expected from someone her size. Instead, she approached the podium like she belonged there because in her mind she did. This is Emma Blake, Richard said, his voice carrying through the auditorium. She's 8 years old. She's also the mind behind a breakthrough our /&D department has failed to achieve for months. There was a stunned silence, a collective breath held as the screens behind them lit up with Emma's design. She didn't offer a formal introduction, didn't deliver a speech crafted by PA handlers. She simply pointed at the diagram on the screen and spoke in her direct, nonsense tone. Your engine's airflow is wrong. It's fighting itself in here, she said, highlighting a section of the blueprint. We rebuilt it, opened it up. Now it breathes the way it should. The simplicity of her words belied the magnitude of what she had done. The engineers in the audience, the ones who truly understood the problem, leaned forward, their skepticism cracking as they processed the elegance of the solution. Richard had anticipated pushback, but what followed wasn't resistance. It was a kind of stunned curiosity. The numbers spoke louder than any title ever could. Performance efficiency had jumped by 14, manufacturing costs had dropped due to the streamlined component design, and the environmental output was cleaner than any competitor on the market. Crowe attempted to salvage control, standing up to question the validity of allowing an unsupervised child to interfere in corporate or backend. But his words fell flat. Emma, unfazed, simply asked, "Did you fix it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, simple, undeniable, devastating. The audience, initially a sea of tailored indifference, was now fully engaged. Investors who had spent the morning nodding through buzzword-laden presentations were suddenly awake. The murmurs had shifted from doubt to intrigue. The media, always hungry for a story, had found a golden headline. Miller Automotive secret weapon is an 8-year-old mechanic. Richard didn't need to say more. Emma's work had already spoken louder than any corporate pitch could. He glanced at Crowe, who now sat stiffly, his power unraveling in front of him. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a coup. The event concluded with Emma receiving a standing ovation. Though she didn't seem particularly impressed by it, she had done what she came to do. Fix the problem. That was all that mattered to her. Backstage, as the board scrambled to calibrate their strategies and pure teams plotted how to spin this unexpected sensation, Richard, Frank, and Emma sat together in a quiet corner. Frank gave Richard a look, half amused, half incredulous. You realize you just started a war, don't you? Richard smiled, but there was steel in his eyes. Then let them come. Emma, still clutching the small drive that had just changed the company's future, looked up at them both. What happens now? She asked, not with fear, but with the same curiosity she had when dissecting an engine. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. Now, Emma, we build something they can't tear down. In that moment, Richard wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or market shares. He was thinking about a little girl who had walked into his life with a wrench and dismantled everything he thought he knew about talent, legacy, and what it meant to truly innovate. The corporate world had underestimated Emma Blake. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The days that followed the presentation were a whirlwind. What had started as a quiet act of defiance in a dusty garage had now exploded into headlines, boardroom debates, and a tidal wave of attention that neither Emma nor Frank had ever asked for. The story of an 8-year-old girl out engineering one of the world's leading automotive companies was too good for the media to resist. Interviews were requested, offers poured in, and Miller Automotive stock, which had been limping along for months, was suddenly on fire. But Richard Miller wasn't interested in media noise. He knew the corporate machine well enough to understand how quickly admiration could turn into exploitation. What Emma had done was more than a viral success. It was the spark of something larger, something that could change the way his entire industry operated. He didn't want her talent buried under headlines. He wanted it to be the foundation of something new. On a quiet morning, away from the glare of cameras, Richard brought Frank and Emma to a sprawling, half-abandoned manufacturing facility on the city's edge. The building had once been a hub of innovation during Detroit's golden age. But now it stood hollow, a relic of a time when machines were built with hands, not just algorithms. Emma's eyes lit up the moment they stepped inside. The air smelled of iron and dust, the kind of scent that made her feel at home. Frank walked beside her, his step slow but thoughtful, as if measuring the heartbeat of the place. "This is where it starts," Richard said, his voice echoing against the empty walls. "I want to build something here, not a factory, not a corporate branch. A workshop, a place where people like you, Emma, can work without someone breathing down their neck. Without rules that choke creativity, a place that teaches, builds, and creates. We'll call it Blake Motors." Frank looked at Richard with a mix of skepticism and cautious hope. "You're talking about starting a revolution, Richard. This isn't just about cars anymore." "I know," Richard replied, his expression calm but resolute, "but I'm done playing safe. You saw what they tried to do to you. They'll keep doing it to people like Emma unless we change the system from the ground up." Emma, who had been running her fingers along a row of old assembly machines, turned to them. "If we're going to fix it, we need the right tools and the right people." That afternoon, the three of them sat in a corner office that had once belonged to a forgotten factory manager. The conversation wasn't about board members or investors, it was about kids. Richard wanted to staff Blake Motors with young people like Emma. Kids from shelters, from the foster system, kids who had been written off by society, but who had the same fire Emma carried. He envisioned a place where they wouldn't just learn mechanics, but where their ideas would shape real products. Frank listened carefully, his old hands clasped together, his gaze occasionally drifting to Emma. "It'll be hard," he said eventually. "You're trying to turn orphans and garage rats into innovators. The system's not built for that." "Then we build a new system," Richard said simply. The project took shape faster than anyone expected. Richard's reputation combined with the viral success of Emma's presentation drew in unexpected allies. Maverick engineers tired of corporate chains, designers who craved real-world problem-solving, and donors who wanted to be part of something authentic. Equipment was salvaged, old machines were repaired, and within months Blake Motors wasn't just a blueprint, it was a living, breathing workshop. Emma was everywhere. She wasn't a figurehead or a mascot. She was in the trenches working alongside older kids and seasoned mechanics alike, teaching them in her blunt, precise way. She didn't care about age or titles. She cared about whether you could fix the thing in front of you. Her hands were perpetually stained with grease, her overalls never quite clean, and people respected her not because Richard Miller told them to, but because within minutes of working with her, they realized she knew more than they did. Frank became the heart of the place, a mentor who had lived through the cycles of industry rise and collapse. He taught with a patience that only decades of experience could provide, but he always made sure the young minds were the ones leading the ideas. "You don't teach innovation," he would say, "you let it teach you." Not everyone approved. The former executives of Miller Automotive, who had lost their power to Emma's quiet revolution, weren't content to watch from the sidelines. Whispers of sabotage circled. Old alliances tried to block supply chains, and rumors were planted in the press about Blake Motors being a naive passion project doomed to fail. But every attack only seemed to harden the resolve of those inside the workshop. Richard, once a man obsessed with image and control, found himself invigorated by the chaos. For the first time in his career, he wasn't managing perception. He was building something real. The first prototype to roll out of Blake Motors was not a flashy supercar. It was a compact, rugged electric utility vehicle designed for city maintenance crews. Built with efficiency, durability, and ease of repair in mind, it was affordable, reliable, and it came with an added signature. Every vehicle carried a small plate inside the cabin engraved with the name of the team that built it. Emma insisted on that. "People should know who made their car," she said, "not just a logo." The first fleet was sold before production had even begun. Orders pouring in from cities impressed by the combination of design and philosophy. Blake Motors wasn't just selling vehicles, they were selling a story. A story of forgotten kids, of old mechanics, and of a little girl who had turned a dare into a revolution. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Richard stood on the mezzanine of the workshop, watching as Emma and a group of new recruits debated over a motor design. Frank sat nearby, offering occasional gruff corrections, but mostly letting the kids hash it out. Richard realized that this mess of voices, ideas, and stubborn persistence was what real innovation looked like. Not a boardroom, not a press release, but a workshop filled with people who refused to be underestimated. Blake Motors was no longer an idea, it was a movement. And it had only just begun. The old garage hadn't changed much. The cracked concrete floor still bore the oil stains of 1,000 repairs. The walls were still lined with shelves cluttered with tools and parts that only Frank and Emma could navigate. And the Mustang, Emma's Mustang, still sat proudly in the center, gleaming under a flickering fluorescent light. Yet something was different now. It wasn't the garage that had changed, it was the world beyond its walls. A year had passed since the day Emma Blake had stood on a corporate stage and silenced a room full of executives. In that year, Blake Motors had gone from a whispered experiment to a movement that was disrupting an industry. What had started as an idea in a forgotten factory had become a living testament to what happened when you placed trust in the hands of people the world had overlooked. But today wasn't about new designs or production targets. Today was about coming home. Richard Miller stood at the entrance of the garage watching Emma as she wiped down the hood of her Mustang with a precision that spoke of ritual, not necessity. She was a little taller now, though still tiny in her red overalls. Her hands perpetually stained with grease, worked methodically, her expression calm. Frank was sitting on an old stool, his cane resting against the workbench, a satisfied grin playing at the corners of his mouth. "You can't leave it alone for a minute, can you?" Richard said as he approached, his voice light, though his throat tightened slightly at the sight. Emma looked up, offering a small smirk. "She's earned it. She's the reason we're here." Richard nodded. That car was more than metal and rubber. It was the start of everything. They spent the afternoon in the garage, not as CEO, mechanic, and mentor, but simply as family. Emma and Frank shared stories about the early days when keeping the lights on had been a victory in itself. Richard listened, contributing only to correct Frank's more colorful embellishments, though he never dared interrupt Emma. She had a way of speaking that commanded attention without demanding it. As dusk settled, Richard suggested they take the Mustang out for a drive. It wasn't a request, it was a need. They hadn't done it before. Despite owning it, Emma had never driven the car out of the garage since fixing it. It had become a symbol, almost too precious to touch. But symbols, Richard believed, were meant to move. Frank handed Emma the keys, his eyes glistening with a quiet pride that no boardroom victory could ever replicate. "Go on, kid. Let's see if she still remembers the road." The streets of Detroit welcomed them with a familiarity that only those who had lived through its scars could understand. The Mustang rumbled through the avenues, drawing stares not because of its make, but because of its driver. Emma sat behind the wheel, her expression a perfect blend of focus and serenity. Richard rode shotgun, for once content to relinquish control. They drove without a destination, weaving through the city that had both abandoned and shaped them. The Mustang was a paradox, an old soul with a new heart. Much like its driver, every turn of the wheel, every purr of the engine was a reminder of how far they had come. Blake Motors had just signed its first international partnership, expanding their education and manufacturing model overseas. Cities that had once scoffed at the idea of garages teaching innovation were now requesting blueprints for their own Blake workshops. But none of that felt as important as this moment. The hum of the engine, the rhythm of the tires against asphalt, the shared silence between three people who had refused to be statistics. They stopped at a hill overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered in the distance. But the real beauty lay in the shadows of old factories, the places where Emma's movement had taken root. Frank leaned against the car, his cane planted firmly, while Emma sat on the hood, legs swinging as she watched the horizon. Richard stood beside them, hands in his pockets, a rare stillness settling over him. "You know," he said quietly, "they're going to call you a genius, an icon. They'll try to write stories about you that make them feel like they discovered you." Emma shrugged. "Let them. We'll still be here building." Frank chuckled, his laughter a rough melody that filled the air. "That's my girl." Richard looked at them, the weight of everything they had fought against pressing against his chest, only to be replaced by something warmer. It wasn't victory, he felt. It was belonging. For a man who had built an empire through control, through meticulous calculation, the realization was humbling. He had found his place not in a tower of glass, but in a garage filled with rust and heart. As night descended, they climbed back into the Mustang. Emma started the engine, and the familiar growl filled the quiet. Richard glanced at her, noticing how her hands rested confidently on the wheel. She didn't look like a child prodigy or a corporate disruptor. She looked like Emma Blake, the mechanic who had once been dared to fix a Mustang and had ended up fixing much more. They drove into the night, the city stretching before them not as a battlefield, But as a canvas, the journey ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and resistance. But it no longer mattered. They weren't just building cars, they were building a future. A future where no one would be underestimated because of where they came from or how small their hands were. The Mustang roared into the darkness, a machine reborn by the hands of a little girl who had taught giants how to dream again. And in that drive, under the stars, they weren't a CEO, a mechanic, and an old man. They were a family, and they were just getting started.